All right, guys, in this section, we're going to take a look at exception. Now, it's not a perfect world. Things happen, things fail. The best you can do is be prepared for it. So Kotlin uses keywords try, catch, finally, and throw for handling exceptions. So let's take a look how we use them. So let's create a variable here called myArray, and let's put in some values in it. So this is essentially an array of integers, and what we will do is we will try and access a value which does not, or an index which does not exist. So let's do print ln and then my array, and then let's access some value that does not exist. And if I run this, I'm going to get an array index out of bounds exception. And there you have it. So in real time, if this was an application, this would actually crash your application and it would be a bad experience for your customer. So the best you can do this, best you can handle this is use a try catch block and enclose this thing that you suspect might throw an exception in a try block, and then have a catch block, and then you can just throw a generic exception so that any exception that might happen or occur in this block gets caught and you do something about it. So you can just push, in this case, let's print in let's try and run this. Now if you see, it's just going to print this value and nothing happened. Your app did not crash. There was no exception thrown. I mean, it was thrown here, but you caught it, and this was handled gracefully. So this is essentially what a try catch exception is. And there is also another keyword called finally, which is the finally block, where you can do something that will happen in spite of the exception being thrown or not. So finally called. And if I run this, finally will always be called. So no matter whether the exception is thrown or not. So let's access the right value. It's going to print the tooth index 0, 1, 2. It's going to print 4, and it's going to print finally called. So even though there was no exception thrown, finally was still called. So finally will always be called no matter what you do. And you could use this as an expression as well. So let's create a function here, and we will just give it something. And this is going to take an integer, or this is going to take an array. So we'll call it array, and it'll be a type of array of type integer. Perfect. And let us return some value here. So in this case, I want to return an integer. Now here you could use this block as an expression. So I could just do return that, and because I don't want to print here, so this let's change this to array, and that let's print a value there, and this case 0, and finally, yeah, we'll just leave it at that. So if we run this, let's comment this, and let's call a method get value with my array, and finally call. So we didn't do anything, so let's print this value as well. So print ln, and I want to print this value here. There you go. So if you see here in this case, we call this method with an array, and we want it to return an integer. So in this case, it did return it, but it executed the finally block before this print ln was called, before the value was returned to it. So finally was called. So I can just remove this finally, and the point of me showing finally there was that finally will always be called no matter what you do. If there's an exception thrown, if there's not an exception thrown, it'll still be called. Now, if I try to access an index that does not exist, so technically an exception will be thrown here and I will be returned 0. So let's return -1. And then since an exception was thrown, the catch block is going to get executed and -1 is returned. Now this is pretty much what you have for try catch. You can create your own exception, so let us do that. We will create, we'll call this my cool exception. And we're going to extend from exception. Right, and let's have a message here. Okay, and let's use this exception here. So we are let's try and so instead of accessing this, let's just throw an exception here. Throw my cool exception, and we're going to use the throw keyword here, and we will say an exception. Okay, oops, if I could only spell. Okay, so if you see, this is kind of highlighted because this is unreachable code. So this, I am throwing this exception before this thing gets executed. So let's try and see what happens. So this exception was thrown, but it was caught with -1. Let's catch a different type of exception. So you can catch as many exceptions as you want, but since this is the superclass, I want to have the first exception here as my cool exception. That'll be of type my cool exception. And what we want to do is we want to return 0. So if my cool exception is thrown, I'm going to return 0, else if that's just a generic exception, we're going to throw -1. So let's run this. So because my cool exception, I manually threw this exception. So in this, you would use this in some cases when there is a condition that you do not want to happen and you want to throw the exception manually. So you would use the throw keyword. And in this case, I'm throwing my own custom exception. And at that point, I am catching this exception. The only condition to this is this, my cool exception needs to be before my exception, because exception is the super of everyone, the super of my cool exception, right? So that's the reason why this was caught, and then 0 was finally returned. Now let's see what happens if I try and catch my cool exception at the end of the block. So let's remove that and let's put it at the end. Now if I run this code, this is going to execute and I'm going to throw my cool exception here, but because it was caught by exception, it returned -1 there and then. It did not execute this block. However, if I want to add a finally here, so, and also let's do so even though the finally block executes, this expression here is unused because -1 was already returned with this. So we're just going to remove that. And that's all we have for exceptions.